Hi, good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. Keep eating. I hope you're enjoying your meal and continue to eat throughout the presentation today, the discussion we have. On behalf of the Pacific Research Institute, I want to thank you all for coming today. My name is Marcey Brightwell, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. I am not a healthcare expert. I am not a drug pricing expert, but I do understand the gravity of the issue. I do rely on specialty medications for my survival, so I appreciate this discussion today. I'm also a former political reporter, so I like asking questions, and this is a treat to be able to ask questions to people who can't run away from me, they can't say no comments, we have them captive, so it's a pleasure to be here today. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Pacific Research Institute, it is a free market think tank based in San Francisco. It has offices in Pasadena and Sacramento. It produces studies, issue briefs, commentaries, and holds events around the state like this one on healthcare, education, the economy, environment, tech, and other California issues. On your chairs today, you do have some brochures and more information about PRI. There's also the recent Impact magazine you can take a look at. And if you want to know more, you can go to pacificresearch.org and sign up for some email updates there. We also want to thank PRI, wants to thank the partners at the Manhattan Institute for co-hosting today's event and for sponsoring today's lunch. So the topic today is California's drug pricing challenge, expanding access and inspiring innovation and creating jobs. And we have quite a distinguished panel here to discuss this. First, we have Senator Tom Coburn, who flew in from Oklahoma for this. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and serves as an advisor to the Institute's project FDA. If you're from Sacramento, you probably know of him from his job as U.S. Senator. He recently retired from the U.S. Senate, which is an interesting conversation to have at a different point. After serving 2 terms representing Oklahoma, and he also served 3 terms in the House of Representatives. But if you're from Oklahoma, you may have known him as Dr. Coburn. He is a graduate of Oklahoma State University. He's a physician, and he graduated from the University of Oklahoma Medical School as well. He specialized in family medicine, obstetrics, and allergy medicine. He's a long advocate of FDA reform, and he co-authored the 2012 book, The Debt Bomb, A Bold Plan to Stop Washington from Bankrupting America. Please welcome Senator Coburn. We also have Sally Pipes. Ms. Pipes is president and CEO of the Pacific Research Institute. Prior to becoming president of PRI in 1991, she was assistant director of the Fraser Institute based in Canada. She writes extensively on healthcare, including regular columns for Forbes.com, Investors Business Daily, and the Washington Examiner. She wrote her first book in 2004, if I got that correct, titled The Miracle Cure, How to Solve America's Healthcare Crisis, and Why Canada is Not the Answer. She went on to write more books, including 3 books on Obamacare, and her new book, The False Promises of Single-Payer Health Care, comes out in spring. Please welcome Sally Pipes. And Brett Johnson, he's Senior Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at the California Life Sciences Association. He's responsible for the development and implementation of government regulations, strategies. He has a long background in healthcare as well. He served in a similar position at CMA. He also worked for the Federal Health Resources and Services Administration under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He holds a law degree and master's degree from George Washington University and a master's of science in bioscience and regulatory affairs from Johns Hopkins. Mr. Johnson is also a veteran of the U.S. Army. Please welcome Mr. Johnson. So I want to remind all of you have an opportunity to ask questions as well. On your tables, you all have white cards, and there should be plenty of cards and plenty of pens to go around. So help me out, write down some questions. We'll kick it off with a few questions, but Tim, there's Tim at the back. Tim will be coming around a couple times to collect some of the questions for about the next 20 minutes. We'll stop collecting questions about 12:40, and we do want to wrap this up at 1:10 to get you on with your days so you can go about your business. But please do submit questions. To start off our discussion today, those of you in the room all know that 2017 was a very significant year for prescription drug pricing issues in California. Legislatively, we don't need to relitigate the legislation and the debate that happened over the summer. But I do think it would be good to start off if we can get the perspective of the panelists on, now that the legislation has passed, now that folks say that this is going to create a national wave for drug pricing laws, where do you think we are now, and where does this go from here since California did pass the legislation? Senator Coburn.
Having gone to med school and been known as Grandpa in medical school, I was the oldest person in my class and had worked in business 10 years. I actually took to heart the lessons that they taught me, and that is, don't treat the symptoms, treat the real disease. So I think all this about price control is solving the wrong problem. The real problem is, how do we create innovation, and how do we do it economically, and how do we make that innovation available to the most people in our country? What we do know is that 1 out of every $3 we spend on healthcare doesn't help anybody. Doesn't keep them from getting sick, doesn't help them get well. That's the biggest problem. And if you actually look at prescription drug prices, the average for a generic is $5.45. Cheapest in the world, except for the developing countries. Cheapest in the world. And for a branded product, it's $8.60. Net, that's what the average prescription costs. So what are we talking about? We're talking about specialty pharmaceuticals. That's what all the uproar is about. And to fix that real problem, what we need is to encourage more innovation, faster approvals through the regulatory body, so we have more competition that lowers those wonderful things. And the reason I can speak with experience, this last 2 years, $200,000 of drugs have been spent on me. Stage 4 cancer, of which I'm free of now. I'm happy that I had insurance, that I had about $5,000 to $6,000 worth of copay I happily paid every year, because every penny of that was worth it. The innovation that came about that actually allowed me to be here today came from an average of $2.6 billion per drug moiety that gets approved. So we need to fix the real problem. And the real problem is the regulatory environment and the false environment that says prescription drugs are high. And I'd make one more point. As we talk about drug pricing, we ought to talk about the prices of the drugs that we buy versus those people who buy our drugs at a mandated price, like Canada, like Germany, like France, like England. And we ought to say, if you're going to tell our pharmaceutical companies what they're going to pay, we're going to tell you what we're going to pay for your cars, we're going to tell you what we're going to pay for your lumber, we're going to tell you what we're going to pay. So what in fact is happening to our pharmaceutical industry is we're undermining the very dollars that are needed for additional research, especially what's coming. In the next 10 years, it's going to be profound change in terms of the new drugs that come to market. Healthcare is going to markedly change because of the innovation of gene splicing and new therapies. And we ought to be about protecting that intellectual property to the point where we can have more of it, not less of it.
What's happening?
We do have to turn those on. Oh, okay, good. I mean, to me, when I look at Tom, he looks so healthy, healthier than most of us, and to think all that he's been through with heart and cancer. I mean, it's unbelievable that he's here and he looks fantastic. So thanks to the pharmaceutical industry, Tom is, alive and well and will be around for a long time to continue to fight for market-based healthcare reform. I'm originally Canadian. On the whole issue of drug importation, we have several senators on both the left and the right, and the president saying we should be able to import drugs from countries like Canada. I think very few people realize that there are fewer people in Canada than in the whole state of California. We have a population of about 36 million people. Most of the drugs come from the United States into Canada under price control, as Tom mentioned, and of course they are cheaper because they're price controlled. But as former Liberal Prime Minister, Member of Parliament and head of the Health Department in Canada, former Socialist Premier of British Columbia, said there is no way that Canada can be the healthcare, can be the drug provider for the United States. There just aren't, we don't have enough drugs for our own people. And the other thing is, as Tom mentioned, generic drugs are much more expensive in a country like Canada than they are here. 85% of all prescription drugs in this country today are generic. And so we want to keep the pipeline open for R&D, for innovation. If you look at the companies that are in the drug business, R&D, from all over the world, they're not practicing if you're Roche, if you're Sanofi, if you're GlaxoSmithKline. The work and the R&D is all being done in America. It is not being done in their countries. These countries have price controls, and it's not in their interest. It costs about $2.5 billion upwards to get a drug from an idea and get it into the marketplace. And it takes 5 to 10 years. Only 2 out of 10 drugs actually make it to market. So it's very expensive, and it takes a lot of time. But we need to keep this open because, as Frank Lichtenberg at Columbia said, for every $1 spent on newer pharmaceuticals, we're saving $7.17 in healthcare costs. So I'm a big promoter of allowing the market to work and not have government, be in control of what drugs can be produced, how much they're going to cost, because that's going to destroy our healthcare system and our pharmaceutical market.
As probably the least healthy-looking person on this panel, I don't have a lot to add to those points, except that I will just say, a lot of the recent conversations, in particular here in California, I think the thing that has concerned me most is more the focus just on list price and what's happening with list price. And a lot of what we've done so far, at least in this state and where that conversation has gone, there hasn't been, despite what's been said in support of some of the movements here, there isn't a lot of interest in understanding the actual cost and what's happening with actual cost. And I unfortunately, as a trade association, can't speak a lot on what individual members do. But I mean, there are lots of drugs that despite all the uproar about list prices, the actual net price or the cost to, say, the state purchasers here is actually less than what a lot of European countries pay for a lot of drugs, and that seems to get missed a lot. And in terms of value also hasn't been part of the conversation here. We've really only focused on the debit side of the ledger, not so much the credit. So it's all about what's the list price on any given day, and not so much about the benefit or the actual net cost. And I think that is going to result in a lot of unintended consequences, and hopefully if there is a genuine interest in understanding cost and value, which value is important in a lot of the other healthcare sectors here, is oft discussed, but we don't really hear a lot of interest in value around the drug pricing and drug cost conversation. So hopefully if this is if this is a path that California is going to move down, we start looking at what the actual net cost and the actual value are for a lot of the medicines that we're getting. And I can tell you right now, there's a lot of interesting things happening in our industry. And again, I can't talk about specific manufacturers, but I mean there are manufacturers that are trying to do what's being called now pure pricing. So a lot of folks are, going to PBMs and major payers and saying, look, we're not going to do all this, behind the curtain rebate stuff. We'll do a discount off the top, and that will be the price. And if it comes up, that's the price you're getting. And actually, I know one of our members had a drug kicked off the formulary because the PBM wasn't going to deal with them if they weren't going to get the rebates. So it's very often talking to our members about what actually happens in negotiations. They will, a payer will take half as much in rebate as opposed to discount because rebates are much more manageable and they look much better on a spreadsheet. So if we're really serious about understanding drug cost, price, and value, we have to get the whole picture. We can't just go after things like list prices and stay there. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. We'll move on to the original question was about the legislation and what happens now after California passed a number of bills, but one particularly dealing with price transparency. Can you speak to that, and what do you think that will do to California, and what do you think that impact will be across the nation?
Well, I can start. I think I addressed a lot of it. I mean, so what's happened in California is there's a 60-day advance notice on a list price change above a certain threshold. As I said, list prices may or may not bear any relation whatsoever to the actual net cost. So, I think depending on whose numbers you go by, if there's a $100 list price, you're probably getting a $40 rebate and another $20 discount on top of that on average. So none of that would be uncovered or understood through the current bill. So, you're looking at list price on one end. So if you go to buy a car, you would understand what the manufacturer's suggested retail price is on that car, and that's really about it. You don't know what the net cost is to the dealer. You don't know what the actual consumer is paying for it. So you're missing a lot on that. And like I said, if California's genuinely interested in that, you have to start looking at the other pieces of the puzzle, and you have to understand what you're getting, because if all you're looking at is what you cost. So if you're like the senator said, if you're paying $100 for a cardiology med, but you're avoiding $500 in hospital cost, you shouldn't want to know that. You shouldn't look at that as just $100 debit, $100 that you're paying. You should understand the value.
There's a lot of talk about letting the free market work. What does that look like? What specifically would need to be done? What changes would need to be done to make that successful?
Gosh, I can't believe you asked that question. I love it. Think for a minute about all of our economy, except education and healthcare. People are coming to you every day through your iPhone, through television, through your iPad, through your computer, saying, buy this. Here's our price. Here's our quality. Here's our guarantee. We're overcome with people wanting to sell us something of what they think is valuable to us. Now just apply that for a moment to healthcare. And I have an example. I delivered 400, almost 500 Amish babies. There's this large sect in Oklahoma of Amish. Not one of those babies paid more than 50% of the lowest price that Blue Cross Blue Shield paid, total cost, total care. Why? Because that guy that got out of school at 12 years of age and was an Amish farmer or Amish carpenter or Amish furniture builder went and asked, what's the best price you will give this to me if I pay you cash right now? So the Amish have had this figured out for 40 years. All it would take is one thing for the president to do, and this applies to pharmaceuticals, it applies to all of healthcare. Issue an executive order that by January 30th, everybody that participates in healthcare will publish their prices, mandatorily publish their price. So you can get it. And the one the one thing I think that was remarkable about the Affordable Care Act is it raised everybody's deductible, which means I'm more interested in shopping for what things cost now because I have more out-of-pocket risk. So the only thing that would have to happen is an executive order. And I want you to think about those people who would be opposed. Oh, you don't want to know what prices you're paying? All the inside deals the insurance do with the hospitals and the hospitals do, and the Schedule 240B stuff, all these things would go away tomorrow. And there can't be a true political resistance to it because it doesn't make any sense that you shouldn't be able to find price. So the one thing that would fix all that is price discovery. And if you have price discovery, the average American, even those on the far left think aren't competent enough to make decisions about their own life, what you would see is about a 25% reduction in healthcare costs in our country in a very short order. So I want you to think about how can you be in a political position to oppose price transparency since you have to go buy it. Why can't you know it before you buy it? And there's all sorts of things out there right now happening in the marketplace that are proving that I'd be happy to go into if you want.
So what is the difference?
Can I just add one thing? I mean, that is one of the great things about health savings accounts is that people have control over their healthcare spending. And you've seen a lot more interest in people asking doctors and hospitals, well, what will that cost? Where can I go? And if you call up a hospital and say, you know, I need an appendix, I have an appendicitis, need my appendix removed, how much will it cost? Well, they can't tell you. And so, you know, you really have to push to find out the price. So price transparency would really open up the market and I think cause a lot and result in a lot of cost reduction. One of the big problems is that right now in this country, about 160 million Americans have employer-based coverage. It's first dollar coverage. People don't know what it costs, and they don't care what it costs. Because they may pay a small copay, they may, you know, pay a small part of the premium, but they don't know. And so people overuse the healthcare system too. But price transparency is a great thing, as Paul mentioned.
Okay, let me just add, there's a medical app out there called Medify. And they're only marketing it right now to ERISA-based plans. But I can tell you there's one company in Oklahoma that's saving $250,000 a month on outpatient testing by directing their employees with incentives like we'll pay you $200 to get it done here rather than where your doctor wants you to get it done with the same outcomes. So, and there's multiple companies in Oklahoma now using this app. And so you're going to see hundreds of millions of dollars in decline in the cost of outpatient services in Oklahoma alone just because of price discovery. And that's what they brought to the table.
I have a question from the audience for Senator Coburn. How do you drive down costs with innovation while protecting intellectual property through your patent protections, or through 12-year patent protections?
Well, one of the ways you drive down cost is make the regulatory environment more smooth. When it takes 3 months to get 20 letters answered on the same thing from the FDA so that a company can know what they need to do next and the regulatory environment does not respond, that tells you we have a problem with regulation. So the average drug coming out has a very short life on it because it's been patented all the time that it's going through this process to get regulatory approval. And that's why you see all these additional patents come on trying to extend the life of that $2.6 billion that was spent, trying to get that extended by making a small modification. And you've seen that where they've done isomers of certain drugs to extend the effectiveness. It's actually a new drug, but it falls under the same drug, so they don't have to go through all the IND that is necessary to do that. And the reason they do an isomer is so that they can actually recapture part of that. But it doesn't matter. Ultimately, competition will work. And some are going to lose. Some drug companies are going to lose. They're going to invest and not have a good enough product. But the fact that you can't know what something costs before you buy it is ludicrous. What else? Would you go buy a car not knowing what it costs? Would you rent an apartment not knowing what the rent is? How about a steak at the grocery store if it had no prices, just said whatever we want? We wouldn't do that. And so what we've done is, both in education and healthcare, we've abandoned the allocation of scarce resources by competition, and we've paid dearly for it. And that's in spite of all the medical innovation that has come forward. So regulatory enhancement, which the 21st century cures had some, but it needs to be more. And that's something Manhattan Institute had worked on for years in terms of trying to streamline the regulatory environment. Never forget the first rule of bureaucracies. Never do what's best when you can do what's safe for the bureaucracy. And it doesn't matter if that bureaucracy is here in Sacramento or in my old hometown of Muskogee, Oklahoma, the city council. They're going to do what's safe, not what's best. And we need them doing what's best for everybody in this country.
And I would add that I think that a really positive note is that Scott Gottlieb, who is a medical doctor and the new head of the FDA, I think I'm quite optimistic that he's going to work hard to reduce some of these regulations, because only 2 in 10 new drugs that make it to market actually cover the cost of R&D. So it's a very expensive business. And you know, as Milton Friedman used to say, if you lived in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and you lived in company housing, and you went to the Hershey grocery store where you didn't pay for anything, of course people consumed a lot more. They put steak in their bag, in their cart, rather than hamburger meat. So people will take the best if they think it's free or doesn't, or costs very little.
We had a few questions come in about single payer. Let's talk about single payer. How would that impact drug pricing?
Well, I'm former Canadian, so I grew up under single payer, and I've written a lot on it, including several books on single payer. Single payer, people don't often realize that single payer means there's one payer, it's the government. There was a new survey that came out, and people, I think it was Kaiser, and they support single payer. But 47% of them said, but that won't affect me, I will keep my private insurance. When they're private insurance companies in Canada, MSA, MSP, CUNC, they all thought, oh, well, we'll still be able to sell private insurance. They were wiped out immediately. And so Canada is a country that has a single payer system and has had a full single payer system since the 80s. Funnily enough, prescription drugs, dental, vision, long-term care are not part of the single payer system. Bernie Sanders' plan and the plan here in Sacramento, SB 562, Laura and Atkins, they're including everything, including the kitchen sink. Prescription drugs, dental, vision, no referrals to see specialists, none of that. The cost of that $400 billion a year, that's more than double the whole state budget of California. Canada, when Paul Martin, the Liberal, was running, he said that he would like to add prescription drugs to he ran on this platform, to the single payer system. When he got into office, he discovered we have long waits. The average wait in Canada today, 20 weeks from seeing a primary care doc to treatment by a specialist. He said, we have this problem, we have ration care, I can't possibly add prescription drugs. The only part of the private insurance industry in Canada that works is what we call extended health, where you can get private insurance for prescriptions, dental, LASIK surgery, cosmetic surgery, because they're not part of the Canada Health Act. But I think it would destroy the access and the innovation if we get single payer in the system. And I'm going to fight till death do me part so that Bernie Sanders stops telling lies to the American people about what a single payer system will do to our health care.
Oh, I'm happy to comment on it. If you're a millennial, there's 85 million of you. And here's what's coming for you. There's $144 trillion of unfunded liabilities right now that you get to pay back over the next 50 years. I'm not going to pay my share. I'll be dead and gone. But you all will get to pay that. Now I want you to calculate what that is. That's $30,000 a year for the next 50 years for each one of you. That's either going to come back through a decreased standard of living, increased taxes, or hyperinflation. No other way it can be paid for. So when Bernie Sanders said we need single payer, the one thing he doesn't tell everybody is, yeah, we'll take your money. We're going to take actually about twice as much money that it costs. We're going to run it through the government, and we're going to give you care that's going to delay the onset of your care. Give you one example of how that's working right now. There's a hospital that was started by 2 anesthesiologists in Oklahoma City called Oklahoma Surgical Hospital. This was before the Affordable Care Act banned doctors from starting hospitals. It's interesting that hospitals can own doctors, but doctors can't own hospitals. Never thought I'd see that in our country. They do 75 cases from Canada a day. Why? Because people can't get the care in Canada. Their prices are 44% of the average price in America for the operations that they offer. They guarantee their outcomes. If you have a complication, they pay for all of it. Now I want you to think about that. And the average doctor there is making $850,000 a year doing all these operations. That's called private enterprise. That's called capitalism. That's guaranteed. And the reason they're busy is because they offer value and quality and excellence. So if we were to start healthcare all over in America, wouldn't we want to reward excellence? Wouldn't we want to reward service? Wouldn't we want to reward efficiency? The last thing you get, if you want to see what single payer looks like, go to an Indian hospital in Oklahoma. Go to a VA hospital anywhere in this country if you want to see what single payer. And ask any doctor that trained in a VA hospital whether they'd ever send their family or one of their patients to a VA hospital. The answer is an absolute 100% no.
I was debating, unfortunately just passed away, but Uwe Reinhardt from Princeton on an international panel on single payer. This was about 5 years ago. And he interrupted me and said, Sally, we have an example of a single payer system in this country that works so well. I said, well, Uwe, what is that? And he said, the VA. And that was, of course, before all of the information's come out about the VA in terms of waiting lists and people not being able to get access to the latest drugs, all of these things. That is a single payer system, but it doesn't work. And I'll just, one more thing, my friend Brian Day, who's an orthopedic surgeon in Vancouver who runs the Canby Surgery Center, is being sued in the BC Supreme Court for having this private surgery center. They treat 60,000 patients a year, and they save the BC government about $300 million. But the hospital employees union thinks that that is unfair and it should be shut down. Well, what's going to happen to those 60,000 people that are treated and they pay out of pocket? Many of them, of course, will have to come to the U.S. and go to the Oklahoma Surgery Center. But even many socialist NDP members support the Canby Surgery Center. But the government is trying to set it down because they don't want competition. That competition will lower prices and give us more access to new treatments.
Yeah, and speaking on behalf of the trade association, I mean, we do support moving towards universal coverage, but with things like single payer, I mean, the details matter. And I'm a policy guy, so it's really something difficult to discuss in the abstract. But if you're talking about a single payer versus what we have now, I mean, right now we have 3 PBMs that essentially control the commercial market. And if you go beyond that, you're looking at maybe 5 payers that, a drug maker is going to deal with for probably 90% plus of the market. So if you're someone who thinks that single payer is going to bring about extraordinary leverage that's going to revolutionize how drugs are paid for and cost, I'm not sure that's the case.
The next question that came in, you touched on in some of your responses, but maybe you could be a little more specific and elaborate. The question came in that what new innovative pricing strategies are on the horizon that could make a difference?
Well, there are some. The direct primary care is working in about 35 states now, where people pay a fixed price per month, per individual. And what that allows is the physician's office to eliminate a third or 40% of their employees because they're all associated with getting permission from somebody who doesn't have their hands on a patient. Concierge medicine, where you pay a fee, a yearly fee, and you're available 24/7. The same thing that's happening with direct primary care. So there are a lot of things out there. What we don't have is innovation and forcing efficiency in healthcare. If you read the study put out by Brookings Institute and consult with Hines at University of Pittsburgh and Southern Cal and also AEI, they talk about all these areas where the lack of breaking up of the large hospital chains, the vertical integration, the horizontal integration of large hospital chains, what it has become is highly inefficient and more costly, not less so. And in fact, there's an ethical question to ask of any doctor that works for a hospital, because they're mandated to refer inside. And I would tell you, as I was trained, a physician is to refer to the best for their patient, not the best for the people they're working for. And so lots of things can happen, but if we're not going to allow a competitive model to work, then we're going to end up with something less than what the excellence of a competitive model can give us. And what I would say, I get this question on, well, what about the people that are falling through the cracks? You think people aren't falling through the cracks with the new Medicaid programs? You give them a Medicaid card, but they can't get in to see anybody? And then they can't get a referral to a specialist? That's not health care. That's given on a Medicaid card and say you got Medicaid now. But there's no health care associated with it. So what we ought to be about is how do we get people health care, and how do we change our health care to preventative health care instead of disease treatment focused. It ought to be on preventing disease rather than treating disease.
And also, I mean, President Obama had said when he was pushing the Affordable Care Act was that, you know, we have so many people that are now going to emergency rooms, and that's very, very expensive care. And so by expanding the Medicaid program in the states, we will reduce that costly ER use. But what's happening, and particularly here in California, is that so many of these people who are on Medicaid from the expansion, they can't get a doctor, or they find they have to wait too long to get a doctor. So emergency room use in California is up about 12.5%. And so, and as in Canada, just retired Madam Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin said, access to a waiting list is not access to health care, and having a care card does not mean you can get a doctor. And that's what we've seen with the long waiting lists, and why this BC Supreme Court case is so very important. I was just going to add to Tom, 49% of graduating new resident specialists are joining hospitals now. So this is going to further reduce the competition by docs setting up their own practices, their own small groups. I think it's very centralization of the medical profession is very, very worrying to me. And as the Association of Medical Colleges have said, by 2020, we are going to have a shortage of about 91,000 docs, half primary care, half general surgeons. Docs are retiring because the system has made it so complicated they can't practice medicine. They have to deal with paperwork because of third-party payer.
Let me just give a reference in case anybody wants to read it. Making Healthcare Markets Work, Competition Policy for Healthcare by the Brookings Institute. That's not a conservative think tank.
You made a good point talking about people falling through the cracks. We hear those stories every day about different people who don't have access to care or access to affordable care. What do you say to those folks who cannot access the specialty medications that they need? The talk of fundamental change is nice to see on the horizon, but what do we do for people today and tomorrow and 6 months from now who need these life-saving medications?
So in my practice experience, and granted it may be different than what you see in California, we didn't have people who couldn't get the medicines. We'd call. If they didn't have insurance and they had cancer, and we'd have one of our buddies that was an oncologist and say, can we work a deal with, and the drug companies would say, yeah, we'll pay for it for that person. I never experienced, and I would treat it 40% Medicaid, all right? And then another 20% no insurance whatsoever. I never had a patient that couldn't get access to care in Oklahoma. Now, I don't know if that's just Oklahoma, but it makes a great question. So name one of those persons who can't get it. Tell me who they are and let me help them. Because most of the time, we can get them care. And if in fact we go to single payer where everybody gets care, the overall level of care is going to go down. I have a retired friend who's a great doctor who now works at the VA. He just wanted something, he wanted something to do because he didn't want to sit there and have to put everything into a computer, and now he has to put everything into a computer at the VA. And he's not going to stay at the VA because he says the care is absolutely atrocious. Even though I'm caring for people, I want to sit down and talk with somebody. Make one final point. The art of medicine is going away, and it ought to scare you to death. As somebody in their mid-30s going through medical school and training, I saw the art of medicine work. And now that we've said a doctor has to sit and look at a computer screen rather than watch their patient and read their body language and ask provocative questions so you could actually really find out what's going on with the patient, we're complying with some government mandate that says you have to put all this on a computer, which isn't safe, anywhere close as safe as a written chart in my office. And so all my partners today refuse to use computer records, refuse to spend time putting all that. And by the way, it has increased the time doctors don't spend on patients rather than decrease it. And so what we ought to do is get back to the art of medicine, which is caring for people and reading body language and doing the things that will actually cause them to get well rather than to read the buzzwords on a computer screen, fill it out, and meet the requirements of Medicare or Medicaid or insurance, and at the same time the patient doesn't get the same quality care that they used to get.
Yeah, and I would just add a couple quick points to that. And on our industry, I mean, we do have the partnership script for prescription assistance, and just about every single one of our members has a multitude of assistance programs and copay assistance and everything else you can imagine. Because I mean, it's not in our interest for anyone who needs medicine who can't get them to go without. I mean, it's something that we have a lot of programs driving towards, and unfortunately, this is also an area where California has gotten active and does have a series of risk to a lot of these programs and making it more difficult for patients to access them.
I think one other point that ought to be made, do you know where the people in the poorest parts of the world get their medicines? From American drug companies. At much below the cost it costs to produce the drugs. So when you pay $8.40 net for a branded prescription, about 40 cents of that is you're helping the third world get well. And we don't ever recognize the pharmaceutical industry for the contribution they make worldwide for people's health. What we do is we find ways to criticize the very people that in 10 years from now we won't see cancer as a death wish. It'll be cured. I'm talking about all of them.
A couple more questions that came in. One is about the AMA, questioning whether is the AMA in some way responsible for drug pricing and healthcare pricing issues? And does it have too much authority, and can that be changed?
When I got to Washington, I was a member of the AMA until I became a congressman, and I saw what they did. And I immediately withdrew from the American Medical Association. American Medical Association represents 1/16 of all the doctors in the country. That's all. But they have this untoward reputation of representing doctors in America, and they don't. And so what you see is the subspecialty organizations and the American College of Physicians, which actually represent the doctors. The AMA is totally overblown and totally ineffective when it comes to what's best for patients in this country. It's what's best for the AMA.
And we've seen the sort of startups of things like Docs for Patient Care and other sort of societies that really do represent doctors. And the AMA membership has been declining at an increasing rate because it's not real. It's really more of a lobbying group and not helping doctors, advance.
Here's a question about pricing. How can we end the cost shift on the American public without ending up in a trade war?
I don't think that's hard at all. I mean, what you need is somebody with some courage to say to our allies what I said earlier. If you're really going to mandate to our pharmaceutical industry what prices you're going to pay, then we're going to mandate what price an Audi costs made in Germany. And look, what next industry are we going to have the government, some socialist countries say, well, we buy all the cars, so we're going to tell you what your cars are going to sell for here. The fact is we are, right now we're the 17th in the world in terms of economic freedom. For 200 years we led the world in economic freedom. We need to get back to being number one in economic freedom. All these benefits will inure to us and to the millennials if, in fact, we do that. So I'm not worried about a trade war. We're the largest consumer of everything in the world. Let me say that again. We're the largest, maybe not vodka, but everything else. We're the largest consumer of everything in the world. Our buying power is immense. And so, hey, what's fair is fair. Price controls in the history of the world have done nothing but limit the supply of whatever you have a price control on. There's not one evidence anywhere of any study anywhere that would say other than that.
And that was part of Diocletian's edict. So they have never worked, whether it was at Nixon, whether it was with Trudeau, going way back in time. So, yes.
Speaking of America leading in consumption, there's a question here about marijuana. Classic California question. Does the legalization of marijuana put any pressure, whether that's positive or negative, on prescription drugs?
I mean, if you look at, this whole thing about opioids and the president saying it's a national emergency. Tom Price, when he was secretary of HHS, said it wasn't a national emergency. But I do think with medical marijuana being legal in California, I don't know, just anecdotally, in San Francisco, I see more and more homeless people on the street who are using marijuana and stuff. So do they go to clinics? How do they, when they have an overdose, if there's drugs to treat that, that's going to cost more rather than less.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of any studies on substitution effect or anything like that regarding, pain medications and marijuana.
There's great studies on marijuana. It is the gateway drug that leads to other drug addictions.
Yes.
There's not one medical study, not one thoroughly controlled medical study that shows a benefit to an inhaled marijuana versus using the synthetic marijuana. Not one. So what we have is a very effective lobby to take a drug that is used to start people down a path, both in terms of taking away their motivation, but also putting them on the path to utilizing other drugs. And there's not one scientific study that there is a benefit of marijuana in terms of health. There's never been one published. So what's this all? It's about us losing our common sense. That you've done it in Colorado, they're doing it in 12 other states are going to do it. It's, we can rationalize. We've got alcohol. It's not a big problem. We just kill about 50,000 people a year with drunk drivers. How many drunk marijuana drivers are you going to see? It's already a big problem in Colorado. I've seen them. So, I don't know what the revenue take is for the state of California. Going to be on marijuana, but it better be really big because the consequences of it are going to be really big.
So you're certainly seeing a number of long-haul truck drivers getting in serious accidents, and it turned out that they've been using marijuana. And I'll just add that in Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that he wants Canada to be the first country that would have legalized marijuana for everyone all over the country. We're one of 3 countries that has a true single-payer system: North Korea, Cuba, and Canada. So Canada is not setting the kind of system that we want in America, and we've got to move away from these increasing entitlements. As Tom talked about, the 85 million millennials. If we keep going down this path, I don't know where are we going to go. To get to a free market country where we actually can have access to the best.
There's actually a moral question that ought to be asked and answered in your mind. Is it ethical to steal the future of your children and grandchildren? Because that's the existential question facing our country today. Is it ethical to do that? Or is it just pure selfishness on our part and the part of the people that represent us politically, that they would spend future children's money on us today? It's something that really bothers me. Because as Tocqueville said, America is going to be great as long as America is good. When America ceases to be good, that's when it's going to fail. And my fear is we're getting close to that because we're abandoning the core principles of sacrificial living to advance our children and our grandchildren.
You mentioned, we talked about what if there was one thing you could do, what would one strategy be to reduce prices and to have an impact on the system? Can I get the other two to comment, Sally and Brad, about what you had just one item that you could make a change with?
Get the government out of the healthcare system. We have 50% of our healthcare is in the hands of government through Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, the VA. Let's get the government out and let the market work so that we can do like we do in all other aspects of our lives, have more access to more products that are better and more efficient and cheaper.
I don't know, it's kind of like having to pick which one of my children are my favorite in terms of what I would change, but I don't have any children, I'm just joking. No, but I would just add, something we talked about earlier, talking about revolutionary ways to pay for medicine. So we are currently, trying out some things like pay for value. I think that's turned out to be a lot more difficult than a lot of people thought, and of course, anytime in one of those deals, as soon as the health plan or whoever it is paying ends up not getting as much in rebates or discounts or what have you, that deal's not there the next year. So that's one of the things that we're trying out. I'm not sure that's the future, but if we were talking about changing things, I think taking a step back. I mentioned earlier the commercial market's essentially controlled by 3 PBMs, and when you go into things like rate filings here in California and you look at drug cost trend estimates, you look at somebody like Kaiser who's around 5%, they don't use a PBM, and then you look at, I guess I should name names, but you look at somebody like Health Net Anthem and they're at twice that, they're closer to 11% and they use a PBM. So if we're talking about PBMs, and America's the only country to use PBMs, if we're talking about they're bringing us value, I don't think the data bears that out. I used to work for CMA and work with physicians, and there are a lot of large physician groups that would love to take on the risk for prescription drugs, and every time they go to a health plan and say, hey, well, you're complaining about drug costs, and you're complaining about how unpredictable prices are, so we're happy to take that risk from you, and they refuse. I think there's a lot more questions to be asked as to whether the system we have set up is really doing what some of the players in it claim it's doing.
We told you we would get you out of here by 1:10, so we want to do that. Before we wrap up, we thought we'd give Senator Coburn a final chance to talk perhaps a little bit about where you see the issue going, considering what is happening or not happening in Washington.
I think as Americans we'll solve this issue. And the reason is I believe greed conquers all technological difficulties. And if you think about that for a minute, innovative people are going to bring solutions to this very inefficient delivery system that we have today, both in the terms of product, drug, procedure, and value. And they will bring it. And money will be saved, and ultimately there will be transparency and price discovery. It will be forced because it's starting now. I can name 20 different apps all around the country that are now being used. Med Incentive is another one where we know if in fact you educate patients, you cut the cost of healthcare 12%. Just think about that. 12% on average an educated patient versus a non-educated patient about their disease. So greed will conquer this. The idea that I can make a buck by bringing a service into the healthcare milieu and offer that service and make money for myself. That's where PBMs are. They have a service. They don't actually offer anything of value. They're just a repository of mass numbers. The fact is, if you had price transparency, on everything in healthcare, tomorrow you would see marked decrease in the cost of healthcare in this country. For pharmaceuticals, for procedures, for supplies, for surgical, for outpatient studies. Matter of fact, freestanding outpatient centers in Oklahoma cost 1/7 of what a hospital procedure does for the same thing. I'm talking diagnostic, I'm not talking surgical procedure. I'm talking diagnostic procedures are 1/7 the cost. So if in fact we had real markets, the American consumer is a whole lot smarter than the politicians think they are. And they can be trusted to make good decisions most of the time for themselves.
If I were still a reporter, I think greed will conquer this would be the soundbite of this discussion today. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and please thank the panelists.